Imagine flying low at 100 feet, completely exposed, hanging out of your helicopter behind your machine gun with 2,000 rounds stacked between your legs, scanning the tree line below for any movement, any shadow, any flicker of metal that might be the muzzle of a rifle pointed right back at you. Your gun is your only real protection. The helicopter shakes and vibrates beneath you. The rotor noise is a constant, deafening thunder so loud that even through your helmet, you can barely hear yourself think. The jungle below is 100 shades of green, dense and impenetrable from above. And somewhere in there, maybe 50 feet below, maybe right under your skids, are men whose entire job is to kill you before you kill them. You are not inside the aircraft. You are not behind armor. You are sitting in an open doorway strapped to the fuselage by a single nylon tether they call a monkey strap. Your boots hanging in the wind at altitude, your body completely exposed from the waist up to anything the enemy decides to send your way. An AK-47 round, a 51 caliber machine gun burst, an RPG that detonates close enough to send shrapnel through you like you aren't even there. And the thing is, you knew all of this when you volunteered for the job. You knew it, and you did it anyway, day after day, mission after mission, sometimes flying 6, 7, 8 sorties in a single day over the same killing fields, the same ambush zones, the same hot landing zones where the enemy was already waiting for you with guns pointed at the sky. We're going to tell you everything about what it meant to be a door gunner in Vietnam, but I have to warn you that some of what you're about to hear is genuinely difficult. These men lived through experiences that most human beings are simply not equipped to process, and many of them never fully recovered from what they saw and did. So if you're still here, let's start at the beginning, because to understand why the door gunner became one of the most important and most dangerous men in the entire Vietnam War, you have to understand how the helicopter itself got there and what that journey cost in blood and improvisation and hard-learned lessons stretching back more than 2 decades before the first Huey ever lifted off over the Mekong Delta. The helicopter's combat debut was about as humble and tentative as you could imagine. When the first experimental rotary wing aircraft started appearing in Allied inventories during the Second World War, they were fragile, underpowered, mechanically unreliable, and barely capable of carrying more than 1 or 2 people along with their own weight. The Sikorsky R-4, which was the first truly practical helicopter to see any kind of military service, was a spindly-looking thing with an open cockpit and a rotor system so temperamental that maintenance crews spent more time keeping it running than crews spent actually flying it. It had a maximum speed of around 75 miles per hour, a service ceiling of about 8,000 feet, and a range so limited that it was essentially useful only for very short, very specific tasks within a tiny operational bubble. But within those limitations, it showed something that nobody could deny. It could land and take off in places that no fixed-wing aircraft in the world could touch. Riverbanks, jungle clearings, mountain ridges, rice paddies, anywhere there was a flat patch of ground a few dozen feet across, the R-4 could set down and lift off again. That capability, limited as it was in 1944 and 1945, pointed towards something that military planners were only beginning to understand. The Army Air Forces used a small number of R-4s in the China-Burma-India theatre toward the end of the war, primarily for medical evacuations of downed pilots and isolated casualties in terrain that no ground vehicle or conventional aircraft could reach. Lieutenant Carter Harmon flew the first recorded combat rescue by helicopter in April 1944, when he extracted a downed British pilot and 3 American soldiers from a jungle clearing in Burma that was accessible only from the air. The flight itself was extraordinarily difficult. The jungle heat reduced the R-4's already limited lifting capacity to the point where Harmon could only take 1 passenger at a time, meaning he had to make 4 separate trips back and forth to extract all 4 men. But he did it. And those 4 men walked away from a situation that would otherwise have killed them. That mission didn't change the course of the war. It didn't even make the newspapers much. But it planted a seed that would germinate slowly through the late 1940s and then explode into something entirely new in the mountains and paddy fields of Korea. By the time the Korean War began in June 1950, helicopters had advanced considerably from the fragile experimental machines of World War II. The Bell H-13 Sioux, a lightweight two-seat observation helicopter, had become the workingman's rotary wing aircraft of the early Cold War period, and the slightly larger Hiller OH-23 Raven was beginning to prove that helicopters could operate reliably enough for sustained military use. Neither of these machines was particularly impressive on paper. The H-13 had a cruising speed of about 80 miles per hour, a useful load of under 500 pounds, and a range of about 250 miles. It looked like someone had taken a bubble-canopied car and bolted a rotor to the top. But in Korea, on those steep, roadless mountain ridges where wheeled vehicles simply couldn't go and conventional fixed-wing aircraft couldn't land, the H-13 turned out to be worth more than its weight in gold. The first and most dramatic use of helicopters in Korea was medical evacuation, a role that the machines seemed almost purpose-built for, even though nobody had really designed them with that in mind. The Army's 2nd Helicopter Detachment, operating with a handful of H-13, began evacuating casualties from frontline positions in the summer and fall of 1950, and the effect was immediate and undeniable. Wounded soldiers who would previously have spent hours or days being carried by litter over mountainous terrain, bleeding out, developing sepsis, dying of shock, were now being delivered to MASH units and field hospitals within minutes of being hit. The survival rates for certain categories of wounds improved dramatically almost overnight. The concept of the golden hour, the critical window after a traumatic injury during which medical intervention can dramatically improve survival odds, became a practical reality rather than a theoretical ideal for the first time in the history of warfare. But medical evacuation wasn't the only thing helicopters were doing in Korea, and the lessons learned there went well beyond saving the wounded. Larger helicopters like the Sikorsky H-19 Chickasaw, which could carry up to 10 fully equipped soldiers, began conducting the first true combat assault operations in history, inserting troops into positions that the enemy hadn't thought to defend, because they assumed no ground force could reach them. On September 13, 1951, the Marine Corps used HRS-1 helicopters, the naval designation for the H-19, to lift an entire rifle company, about 228 men, onto a hill position in what became known as Operation Summit. It was the first helicopter-borne combat assault in military history, and it worked almost perfectly. The Marines secured their objective before the enemy even understood what was happening. The implications were staggering, but alongside these early successes came the first brutal lessons about helicopter vulnerability, and those lessons were written in wreckage and blood. The simple, unavoidable reality was that a helicopter in flight is a machine that cannot afford to be hit in the wrong place. Fixed-wing aircraft could absorb considerable punishment and keep flying. Helicopters were different. A single rifle round through a hydraulic line, an oil cooler, or the wrong spot in the rotor head could bring a helicopter down instantly and violently. The rotor system alone was an engineering marvel of hundreds of moving, interconnected parts, each one critical, none of them armoured, all of them potentially catastrophic if damaged. A burst of automatic fire from below could shred a rotor blade, unbalance the entire system, and cause a crash that nobody walked away from in the space of a few horrifying seconds. This wasn't a hypothetical concern, it was a documented reality that the Army and Marine Corps were confronting in Korea, and it posed a fundamental problem that nobody had yet figured out how to solve. You couldn't armour a helicopter adequately without making it too heavy to fly, and if you couldn't armour it, you had to find another way to protect it. But what way? The answer, when it finally came, would not come from a design bureau or a military planning committee. It would come from individual soldiers in the field, improvising, under fire, solving the problem with whatever they had available. And that answer would eventually reshape the entire doctrine of airborne warfare. Vietnam changed everything. By the time American advisors began arriving in South Vietnam in significant numbers in the early 1960s, military planners had spent years studying the lessons of Korea and thinking hard about what the helicopter could do if you really committed to it, if you built an entire operational doctrine around its unique capabilities instead of using it as a supplement to conventional ground operations. The Army's concept was called air mobility, and at its core was a deceptively simple idea. If you could move your infantry by helicopter faster than the enemy could move on foot, you could always be at the right place at the right time, you could concentrate forces rapidly, you could strike where the enemy least expected, and you could extract your troops before they could be encircled and destroyed. The jungle terrain of Vietnam, which made conventional vehicle movement almost impossible and turned every road and trail into a potential ambush, seemed almost tailor-made for this concept. You could simply fly over all of it. The Army established the 11th Air Assault Division at Fort Benning, Georgia, in February 1963, specifically to develop and test airmobile concepts. This was essentially a laboratory for a new way of fighting, and the man most responsible for turning it into a practical doctrine was General Hamilton Howze, whose name would become attached to the board that produced the initial report laying out the airmobile concept in detail. The Howze Board, as it became known, concluded in 1962 that the Army needed to reorganize itself around helicopter-borne forces to a far greater degree than anyone in the traditional ground forces was comfortable with, and that the helicopter, specifically the helicopter as a weapons platform, not merely a transport vehicle, was going to be central to the future of land warfare. The report was controversial. Many senior officers thought it was unrealistic, even slightly crazy. The Air Force was furious about it because it implied that Army helicopters would be doing things that the Air Force thought only Air Force aircraft should do. But the logic was hard to argue with, and events would prove it more than right. The helicopter at the center of all of this thinking was the Bell UH-1 Iroquois, which had been flying since 1956 and was rapidly becoming the workhorse of Army aviation. But nobody called it the Iroquois. They called it the Huey, a nickname derived from its original designation, HU-1, before the Army revised its designation system, and the name stuck so completely that entire generations of people grew up knowing that iconic machine by no other name. The Huey was, by the standards of its era, a remarkable piece of engineering. Its single Lycoming T53 turboshaft engine, a turbine rather than a piston engine, which was a major step forward in reliability and power-to-weight ratio, could produce around 1,100 shaft horsepower in the early models, enough to lift the aircraft, its crew of 2 or 3, and a meaningful payload of troops, supplies, or weapons with reasonable margins. The twin-blade rotor system produced that distinctive whop-whop-whop sound that became one of the defining auditory signatures of the entire Vietnam War, so recognizable that veterans still report hearing it in their dreams decades later. The UH-1B model, which entered service in 1961 and would be one of the primary variants used in the early years of Vietnam, was about 57 feet long from nose-to-tail rotor, stood about 14 feet tall, and had a rotor diameter of 44 feet. It could carry up to 7 soldiers in addition to its crew, or a combination of cargo and fewer passengers, and in the medevac configuration it could accommodate 3 litter patients plus 1 ambulatory. Its maximum speed was around 135 miles per hour, though 120 was a more typical cruising speed, and its service ceiling was around 19,000 feet, though operational missions rarely took it anywhere near that altitude. The later UH-1D and UH-1H models, which arrived in Vietnam from 1963 and 1966 respectively, were significantly larger and more capable. The H model's T53-L-13 engine produced 1,400 shaft horsepower, giving it considerably better performance in the hot, humid conditions of Vietnam, where engine power fell off dramatically compared to cooler environments at sea level. The decision to deploy Army helicopters to Vietnam in force came in stages. The first dedicated helicopter unit to arrive was the 8th and 57th Transportation Companies, which flew their CH-21 Shawnees, a twin-rotor tandem-rotor helicopter that looked absurdly ungainly compared to the sleek Huey, into Saigon in December 1961. These were followed quickly by UH-1 units as the Huey's superiority for the conditions of Vietnam became apparent. By the end of 1962, there were already over 300 American helicopters in South Vietnam, and the number was growing rapidly. The Army was essentially running a massive live-fire experiment in airmobile warfare, and the results were coming in fast. The early lessons were mixed in ways that should have been predictable, but still came as something of a shock. When helicopters were used to insert South Vietnamese troops into Viet Cong-held areas, they worked, sometimes, brilliantly. At the Battle of Ap Bac in January 1963, American advisors and their South Vietnamese allies used helicopters to airlift a battalion of ARVN troops into a landing zone near the village of Tan Phu in the Mekong Delta, planning to encircle and destroy a Viet Cong battalion estimated at around 350 men. What happened instead was a disaster. The Viet Cong didn't run. They fought back with disciplined, accurate fire, and the helicopters, which had been expected to intimidate the enemy into withdrawal, instead became targets. Of the 15 UH-1 and CH-21 helicopters involved in the operation, 4 were shot down and 9 were damaged. 3 American advisors were killed. The ARVN troops refused orders to advance, and the Viet Cong escaped with most of their forces intact. The battle became a major news story and a source of significant embarrassment for the American military, but more importantly, it demonstrated with horrible clarity that helicopters without adequate protection, both organic to the aircraft and provided by escort, were extremely vulnerable to ground fire from a disciplined, prepared enemy. What APBAC showed, among other things, was that the door gunner, such as the role existed at that point, was completely inadequate for what the situation demanded. At the beginning of American helicopter operations in Vietnam, the crew of a typical Huey consisted of a pilot, a co-pilot, and a crew chief. The crew chief was responsible for maintaining the aircraft, but in flight he also doubled as the door gunner, typically manning a single M60 machine gun on the right side of the aircraft. This arrangement had been developed in the relatively benign environment of test operations and training exercises, where the assumption was that any ground fire encountered would be light and sporadic. In the real Vietnam, it was neither. The Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese Army were experienced guerrilla fighters who understood instinctively that a helicopter on approach to a landing zone was one of the most vulnerable objects in the sky. Slow, predictable, tied to a specific piece of ground, unable to maneuver freely. They concentrated their fire on landing zones, set up ambushes along known approach routes, and learned very quickly that a burst of accurate fire during the critical seconds of landing or takeoff could bring a helicopter down in a place where the crew and any troops aboard could then be killed or captured at leisure. The response to this growing threat was improvised at the field level before it became official doctrine, which was the pattern for so many developments in Vietnam. Helicopter crews started adding a second gunner on the left side of the aircraft, a shotgun rider, a soldier whose only job was to handle the left door gun and provide the crew with coverage on both sides during the critical moments of approach, landing, and extraction. This fourth crew member had no official designation at first, no specific rank requirements, no formal training pipeline. He was just a soldier who could handle an M60 and wasn't completely overwhelmed by the experience of hanging out of a moving aircraft at altitude while people were shooting at him. The requirements, in other words, were minimal on paper and almost impossibly demanding in practice. The shotgun rider's position was, by any objective assessment, about as exposed and dangerous as any combat role in the entire American arsenal during Vietnam. He sat in the open doorway of the Yabba helicopter with his legs hanging out into the slipstream, held in place by a nylon strap, the monkey strap, looped around his torso and attached to a hard point on the airframe. There was no seat in the conventional sense, no restraint system designed for combat G-forces, no armor plating between him and the jungle below. In theory, the monkey strap would prevent him from falling out if he lost his grip or was knocked off balance. In practice, the strap was only as good as the attention the crew gave to securing it properly, and in the rush and chaos of combat operations, proper attachment procedures were not always followed as carefully as the manual specified. Men fell out. Some survived because they were over friendly terrain or at low altitude. Some did not. Officially, the role was still informal when American combat involvement began escalating sharply after the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution in August 1964 and the deployment of the first major American ground combat units in early 1965. But the reality in the field had already created the position, whether the Army had formalized it or not. When the 1st Cavalry Division Airmobile, the Army's flagship helicopter unit, landed at An Khe in September 1965 and began operating in the Central Highlands, the 4th crew member was a fixture of virtually every combat helicopter crew. The Army simply ratified what field experience had already made standard practice. The door gunner, now formally recognized as a distinct crew position with official training requirements, a specific rank structure, and eventually a dedicated training program, was part of the machine. And that formalization mattered. It meant pay grades, it meant official training pipelines, it meant that the Army was now committing to producing door gunners systematically rather than relying on whoever happened to be available and willing to hang out a helicopter door with a machine gun. The door gunner's military occupational specialty, or MOS, was designated 67N20, which was the crewman's code, and later more specifically 67U for helicopter crew members. The paperwork gave the role institutional legitimacy. The combat gave it everything else. The scale of helicopter operations that developed in Vietnam over the course of the war is genuinely difficult to convey without numbers, and even the numbers are almost too large to be meaningful. By the peak of American involvement in 1969, the Army alone was operating more than 3,900 helicopters of all types across South Vietnam, requiring tens of thousands of crew members, pilots, co-pilots, crew chiefs and door gunners to keep them flying and fighting. At the height of operations, American helicopters were flying more than 1 million sorties per month across the country, a tempo of operations that had never been seen in the history of rotary wing aviation and has not been seen since. The logistics required to sustain that operation, the fuel, the ammunition, the spare parts, the maintenance personnel, the airfields and forward operating bases, were staggering, and all of it was built on the foundation of the individual crews who flew those missions, day after day, in conditions that progressively degraded both the aircraft and the men who flew them. The terrain of South Vietnam imposed its own specific demands on helicopter operations, and understanding those demands is essential to understanding what door gunners were actually dealing with on a daily basis. South Vietnam is approximately 650 miles long from the demilitarized zone at the 17th parallel to the southernmost tip of the Ca Mau Peninsula, and its geography varies enormously across that distance. In the far north, the I Corps area along the DMZ, the terrain is mountainous and heavily forested. Steep ridgelines running roughly east to west toward the coast, narrow river valleys, triple canopy jungle that could hide entire NVA divisions from aerial observation. Helicopter operations in this terrain were constrained by the ridgelines, which funneled approach routes and created predictable corridors that the NVA learned to defend. The weather was also frequently terrible. The northeast monsoon brought low clouds and heavy rain to the northern provinces from roughly October through March, reducing visibility to near zero and grounding helicopters for days at a time, then clearing suddenly to give the enemy perfect observation of American aircraft during operations in the Central Highlands, 2nd Corps. The terrain moderated somewhat, opening into broader valleys with higher plains that offered better conditions for helicopter operations, in some respects, while presenting their own challenges. The A Shao Valley, which became one of the most contested pieces of real estate in the entire war, was a roughly 25-mile-long corridor running roughly north-south along the Laotian border, used by the NVA as a major logistics route and staging area for operations against the coastal lowlands. The valley floor was relatively flat and offered adequate landing zones, but the ridgelines on both sides were steep and heavily forested, and the NVA had fortified the valley so thoroughly by the midpoint of the war that operations into the A Shao were among the most dangerous helicopter missions in Vietnam. The elevation, the valley floor, was at about 2,500 feet above sea level, with the surrounding ridges rising to 4,000 to 5,000 feet, also reduced helicopter performance compared to sea level operations, a significant constraint that affected load capacity and maneuverability. The 3rd Corps area around Saigon and the Mekong Delta to the south presented entirely different challenges. The delta was flat, crossed by an endless network of rivers, canals, and irrigation ditches, covered in rice paddies and dense riverside vegetation. There were virtually no natural landing zones in the conventional sense. Almost everywhere was either open paddy field or dense riverine vegetation, and the paddy fields were often soft enough that helicopter skids would sink if the aircraft sat on the ground for more than a few seconds. Operations in the Delta required a different approach entirely. Helicopters often hovered just above the water's surface while troops jumped into waist-deep paddy, or they landed on dikes, the narrow earthen banks separating paddy fields, that were barely wide enough for a helicopter's skids. The Viet Cong infrastructure in the Delta was deeply embedded in the civilian population, making target identification even more difficult than elsewhere, and the flat terrain gave enemy gunners unobstructed lines of sight to low-flying helicopters from considerable distances. The weather across all these regions created operational challenges that door gunners and helicopter crews had to deal with on top of everything else. The Vietnamese climate is dominated by monsoon patterns that differ between the northern and southern parts of the country, meaning that there was almost always some part of Vietnam experiencing monsoon weather, while another part had relatively good flying conditions. The monsoon rains turned dirt landing zones into mud pits that grounded aircraft, reduced visibility to near zero, and saturated the jungle in ways that affected the behavior of both combatants and their weapons. Humidity in the lowlands routinely exceeded 90%, which affected ammunition. Powder absorbs moisture over time and can degrade performance, and contributed to the rusting and jamming problems that plagued M60 machine guns in the field. Door gunners who prided themselves on keeping their weapons in perfect condition found that the Vietnamese climate was actively working against them every hour of every day. The North Vietnamese Army's understanding of American helicopter tactics also evolved continuously throughout the war, and that evolution was one of the most significant ongoing challenges for helicopter crews, including door gunners. In the early years, NVA and Viet Cong units often reacted to helicopter insertions with initial surprise, dispersing and trying to avoid contact rather than standing and fighting. By 1965 and 1966, that had changed. NVA tactical doctrine for engaging American airmobile forces had been developed and disseminated across units in the South, incorporating the lessons learned at Ia Drang and in subsequent engagements. The doctrine emphasized three main points: anti-aircraft fire to attrite helicopter assets and force changes in operational patterns, close engagement of American ground forces to neutralize air and artillery support, and intelligence collection to anticipate landing zone selections and pre-position ambush forces. The anti-aircraft component of this doctrine was particularly relevant to door gunners because it meant that in heavily contested areas the enemy was actively seeking to kill helicopter crew members rather than simply shooting at aircraft as targets of opportunity. NVA anti-aircraft crews were trained and organized, operating in coordinated batteries rather than individually, using interlocking fields of fire to engage approaching helicopters from multiple angles simultaneously. A flight of Hueys on approach to a landing zone in a heavily defended area might simultaneously be engaged by a 12.7mm DSHK from the north, small arms from the east and west, and RPGs from the south, all fires converging on the point where the aircraft were most vulnerable, the final approach and landing phase. For the door gunner, this meant engaging multiple threat sources almost simultaneously, prioritizing the most dangerous while maintaining awareness of all of them, and doing so while the aircraft was in a phase of flight where the pilot had limited ability to maneuver. The RPG, rocket-propelled grenade, specifically the Soviet-designed RPG-2 and later the improved RPG-7, was one of the most feared weapons in the enemy's anti-helicopter arsenal. The RPG-7, which became increasingly common from about 1967 onward, fired a 93mm rocket-assisted shaped charge grenade that could penetrate armor and was deadly against the thin-skinned structure of a helicopter at ranges up to about 500 meters in trained hands. An RPG team needed only one accurate shot to bring down a helicopter. The RPG-7's reliability, simplicity, and effectiveness against unarmored or lightly armored targets made it ideal for the guerrilla anti-aircraft role, and the NVA and Viet Cong used it extensively against American helicopters throughout the war. Door gunners learned to watch for the specific visual signature of an RPG launch, the backblast from the rocket motor, and the smoke trail of the grenade in flight, and to engage the launcher position immediately and aggressively whenever they detected it. Getting a burst of M60 fire onto an RPG team in the fraction of a second between when they fired and when a second shot could be prepared was one of the most critical and demanding skills in the door gunner repertoire. The door gunner's relationship with the pilots and crew chief who shared his aircraft was one of the defining features of helicopter crew life in Vietnam, and it was a relationship unlike almost anything in conventional infantry service. The four men of a Huey crew, pilot, co-pilot, crew chief, and door gunner, spent more time in close proximity to each other in conditions of shared extreme danger than almost any other combination of people in the military. They flew together day after day, sometimes for months at a stretch. They knew each other's voices, mannerisms, habits, and reflexes with an intimacy that extended well beyond the professional. They were, in the fullest sense of the word, a team. Not a bureaucratic team assembled by assignment officer decision, but a team forged by the specific alchemy of shared danger and mutual dependence that combat creates. The crew chief's role deserves particular mention in any account of door gunners because the two positions were so closely linked that they were sometimes effectively merged, and the crew chief's knowledge of the aircraft was the foundation on which the door gunner's effectiveness rested. The crew chief was responsible for all maintenance of the aircraft, inspecting it before every flight, making whatever repairs were within his capability in the field, tracking the aircraft's maintenance history and reporting discrepancies to the Aviation Maintenance Unit. He was typically an NCO, a sergeant or staff sergeant, with specific training in helicopter maintenance and a proprietary relationship with his aircraft that was one of the most intensely personal in military service. A crew chief who took pride in his work maintained his aircraft at a standard that the paperwork systems sometimes couldn't fully capture. He knew exactly how the aircraft felt, how it sounded, what was normal and what wasn't, in ways that no periodic inspection could substitute for. When the aircraft was in the air, the crew chief managed the right door gun position, while the assigned door gunner manned the left. The two gunners coordinated their fire, each covering his side of the aircraft, communicating threat locations through the intercom system and managing their sectors of fire to avoid creating gaps that the enemy could exploit. The weapons that door gunners carried were not chosen arbitrarily. They were the product of both doctrine and field experience, shaped by the specific demands of firing from a moving aircraft at targets that were almost always partially or fully concealed, at ranges that varied wildly from engagement to engagement, in conditions that tested both the weapon and the man behind it to their absolute limits. And the primary weapon, the one that defined the door gunner's role from the beginning of American combat involvement to the very end, was the M60 machine gun. The M60's origins go back to the final years of the Second World War, when American ordnance engineers began examining the German general-purpose machine gun concept with great interest. The German Wehrmacht had fielded two remarkable weapons in that conflict, the MG-34 and its successor, the MG-42, that operated on a principle the Americans hadn't fully embraced. A single machine gun design that could serve equally well as a light squad automatic weapon, a sustained fire company-level support weapon, and a vehicle-mounted defensive and offensive arm. The MG-42 in particular, with its cyclic rate of approximately 1,200 to 1,500 rounds per minute, had been the most terrifying automatic weapon encountered by Allied ground forces in Europe, producing that distinctive buzzsaw sound that was immediately recognizable and immediately frightening in a way that slower-firing weapons weren't. More importantly, the German system used quick-change barrels that could be swapped in seconds by a trained crew, solving the overheating problem that plagued sustained fire from conventional machine guns. The Americans wanted something like that for the post-war army, and the result, after nearly a decade of development by various contractors and ordnance facilities, was the M60, which entered Army service in 1957. It chambered the 7.62 by 51mm NATO round, a cartridge developed in the early 1950s to give NATO member nations a common rifle and machine gun caliber, and it fed from disintegrating link metal belts that allowed continuous fire without the box magazine limitations that had plagued lighter automatic weapons. The gun was gas-operated, meaning it used a portion of the propellant gas from each fired round to cycle the action and chamber the next cartridge, and it fired from an open bolt, meaning the bolt sat back in the receiver ready to strip a round from the belt and chamber it only when the trigger was pulled, which prevented cook-offs, the dangerous phenomenon where residual heat in the chamber causes a round to fire without trigger pressure. In its standard infantry configuration, the M60 weighed about 23.15 pounds unloaded, was approximately 43.5 inches long, and had a rate of fire between 500 and 650 rounds per minute. That rate of fire is worth thinking about for a moment. At 600 rounds per minute, the gun is firing 10 rounds every second. A 100-round belt of ammunition, a standard load for many engagements, is gone in about 10 seconds of continuous fire. That's not a lot. That's why door gunners carried as much ammunition as they and their aircraft could possibly manage, and it's why ammunition management was one of the most critical skills in their entire repertoire, because a door gunner who ran out of ammunition over a hot landing zone wasn't just ineffective, he was a man sitting in an open doorway with no way to protect himself or his aircraft from what was coming up from below. The M60's effective range from an infantry position was typically cited as about 1,100 meters, roughly 1,200 yards, for area targets, meaning you could suppress a position at that range, even if you couldn't aim precisely enough to hit a specific individual. The maximum range at which a fired round remained dangerous was considerably farther, somewhere around 3,700 meters, which is relevant for helicopter operations because a door gunner firing downward at a steep angle from altitude could put rounds into the ground at distances that differed significantly from the nominal effective range depending on airspeed, altitude, and angle of fire. In practice, most engagements from helicopters took place at much shorter ranges, from a few hundred meters down to essentially point blank when the aircraft was landing or taking off, and at those ranges the M60 was devastatingly effective. In the door gunner role, the M60 was typically mounted on one of several different systems designed to make it more manageable in flight. The simplest was the M23. Armament subsystem, a pintle mount attached to the aircraft's floor structure at the door position, which allowed the gun to rotate in azimuth and elevate or depress through a useful arc without requiring the gunner to support the full 23-pound weight of the weapon himself. This was important because holding a 23-pound machine gun steady against the aerodynamic forces acting on it at 100 miles per hour, while also absorbing the recoil of continuous fire, while also scanning for targets, while also managing your ammunition belt, while also maintaining your situational awareness about where your helicopter is and what it's doing, that's a task that would quickly exhaust even the strongest man if he had to support the weapon's full weight entirely with his own arms and shoulders. Some units used a bungee cord system, attaching the gun to a bungee loop fixed to the ceiling of the cargo compartment, which provided a kind of elastic counterbalance to the weapon's weight while still allowing relatively free movement. Experienced door gunners developed strong preferences for one mounting system over another, often based on the specific types of missions they flew most frequently. A gunner who spent most of his time providing suppressive fire during troop insertions preferred a mount that allowed rapid wide-arc movement for area suppression. A gunner who flew mostly medevac missions wanted something that gave him precise control for picking specific targets at short ranges. The ammunition load was a constant calculation and a constant concern. A standard combat configuration carried between 2,000 and 4,000 rounds of 7.62mm belted ammunition per gun position, depending on the mission type, the expected duration of engagement, and the weight limitations of the aircraft on any given flight. At the higher end, 4,000 rounds sounds like a lot until you do the arithmetic. At the M60's standard cyclic rate, you can burn through 4,000 rounds in about 7 minutes of continuous fire. In a sustained close-range engagement over a hot landing zone, 7 minutes of trigger time could feel like both an eternity and no time at all simultaneously. Every fifth round in the belt was a tracer, a cartridge loaded with a pyrotechnic compound in the base of the bullet that burned during flight, leaving a visible streak of light that allowed the gunner to see where his rounds were going and correct his aim in real time. In daylight, this was helpful. At night or in low visibility conditions, it was absolutely essential. American tracers burned red-orange. North Vietnamese and Viet Cong tracers typically burned green, which meant that in a night engagement you could see not only where your own fire was going, but also roughly where the enemy's fire was coming from. The M134 minigun was the other major weapon in the door gunner's arsenal, though it was associated more specifically with armed helicopter gunships than with the transport and medevac Hueys. The minigun was not a machine gun in the conventional sense. It was a rotary-barreled Gatling-type weapon driven by an electric motor, with 6 barrels rotating continuously, each one firing in turn as it reached the firing position. This arrangement distributed the heat of firing across 6 barrels rather than 1, allowing sustained fire rates that would be mechanically impossible for a conventional single-barrel weapon. The M134, in its standard configuration, could fire at rates between 2,000 and 6,000 rounds per minute, selectable in 2 or 3 settings depending on the specific installation. At 6,000 rounds per minute, the gun fires 100 rounds per second. The sound it produced at high rates of fire was not the staccato chatter of a conventional machine gun. It was a continuous mechanical roar, almost a single sustained note, like a massive piece of industrial machinery suddenly brought to bear on human targets. Soldiers on the ground who survived being fired on by a minigun described the experience as something qualitatively different from being shot at, not a firefight in any normal sense, but something closer to being hit by a wall of metal moving at the speed of sound. The minigun was electrically powered and required a significant power supply from the aircraft, which meant it was primarily installed on dedicated gunship variants of the Huey and later on the AH-1 Cobra attack helicopter, rather than on transport slicks. But in the gunship role, it was devastating. A single burst from a minigun at 6,000 rounds per minute saturated an area the size of a football field with so many rounds that it was statistically nearly impossible for any unprotected human being in that space to survive. The gunships would orbit a landing zone or a contact area, making firing runs at low altitude, and the volume of fire they could generate in a few passes was simply beyond the capacity of any ground-mounted weapon to match. The distinction between slicks and gunships is important because it defined the door gunner's experience in fundamentally different ways depending on which type of aircraft he was assigned to. Slicks, the transport Hueys that carried troops, supplies, and casualties, were the backbone of the airmobile concept. In a typical air assault, the slicks would carry the assault infantry into the landing zone, while the gunships provided protective fire, suppressing enemy positions around the LZ during the critical approach, landing, and departure phases. The slick door gunner's primary mission was defensive. His job was to protect his aircraft and its passengers during those periods when the Huey was most vulnerable, particularly during the slow, low final approach to the LZ and the equally dangerous moment of liftoff when the aircraft was heavily loaded, underperforming, and committed to a specific flight path. He was not, in theory, there to go looking for targets. He was there to respond to threats. In practice, the distinction between defensive and offensive fire became almost meaningless in the conditions of Vietnam. A hot landing zone was a hot landing zone, regardless of what your technical mission statement said, and when enemy fire was coming from the tree line 200 meters to the left, the slick door gunner was going to engage those positions with everything he had, whether or not the mission profile called for offensive suppressive fire. The gunships were a different story. Their door gunners were actively part of the weapon system, working in coordination with the pilot and co-pilot to bring fire onto targets designated by ground controllers, forward air controllers, or the crew's own visual observations. Gunship crews developed a tight, almost telepathic integration of movement and fire, the pilot maneuvering to put the gunners on their targets, the gunners providing the precise feedback, left, steady, firing, that let the pilot know exactly where the fire was going. Training door gunners for this role was a process that evolved considerably over the course of the war, starting from almost nothing in the early days and eventually developing into a structured, formal program that attempted to teach men in weeks what their predecessors had learned in months of bleeding over hot LZs in the Central Highlands and the Delta. At the beginning, there was no dedicated door gunner school. Units trained their own gunners using whatever methods the more experienced crews had developed, which meant training quality varied enormously from unit to unit and from aircraft company to aircraft company. A gunner assigned to a unit that had been operating in Vietnam for 6 months had access to a wealth of accumulated hard-won knowledge. A gunner assigned to a freshly arrived unit that was itself learning everything from scratch might have nothing to fall back on except his basic military training and whatever he could pick up from the other men in his company. The formal training that developed over time covered a specific, detailed curriculum designed to address the unique demands of the role. New door gunners were first introduced to the aircraft itself, the layout of the cargo compartment, the location of every system and component that might be relevant to their work, how to communicate with the pilots using the intercom system built into their flight helmets, how to read and use the clock system for indicating directions to the rest of the crew. The clock system was one of those pieces of institutional knowledge that experienced crewmen could barely imagine operating without, and that new men sometimes struggled to internalize quickly enough. The aircraft was treated as a clock face, with 12 o'clock being straight ahead and 6 o'clock being directly behind. Targets, threats, and landmarks were all described by clock position. Contact at 9 o'clock, moving right, or landing zone at 2 o'clock, approximately 800 meters. In the noise and confusion of combat, this system allowed the crew to communicate critical spatial information with minimum words and maximum precision. They learned aircraft formation flying, how to maintain correct position in relation to other helicopters in the flight, why proper spacing and alignment mattered both for mission effectiveness and for the safety of other gunners in the formation who might otherwise find themselves in the line of fire from an adjacent aircraft. They learned the characteristics of their weapons in exhaustive detail, how to clear a jam under fire, how to change a barrel on the M60 when it had been firing long enough that the metal was glowing, how to diagnose and correct feed problems, how to time their fire in relation to the aircraft's movement to compensate for the ballistic effects of the helicopter's forward velocity on their rounds. And they practiced repeatedly the emergency procedures that they hoped they would never need, what to do if the aircraft took a hit and went down, what to do if the pilot was incapacitated, what to do if they themselves were wounded and couldn't continue firing. The physical demands of the job were considerable. A door gunner in a full day of operations might fly 6 to 8 sorties, each lasting anywhere from 30 minutes to several hours. Over the course of those hours, he was maintaining continuous vigilance, scanning the terrain below and around the aircraft for threats, managing his weapon and ammunition, communicating with the crew, and enduring the physical stress of the flight environment. The noise, the vibration, the wind blast, the heat in the lowland areas, or the surprising cold at altitude, the disorientation of constantly changing altitudes and headings, and the sustained physiological arousal of operating in a potentially hostile environment where the transition from uneventful flight to furious combat could happen in a second with no warning at all. Door gunners learn to read the terrain the way experienced infantrymen learn to read a jungle tree line, looking for the specific visual cues that indicated human presence: disturbed vegetation, fresh tracks visible from above, the dull glint of metal, the absence of movement in an area where movement would normally be expected. The Viet Cong were masters of concealment and had spent years developing techniques for hiding from aerial observation. But they weren't invisible, and an experienced door gunner with several months of operational flying behind him could often spot things that a new man would fly straight over. The most difficult technical challenge was accurate fire from a moving platform. In conventional infantry combat, the relationship between shooter and target is essentially static. Both are on the ground, movement is relatively slow, and the fundamental geometry of marksmanship applies in more or less familiar ways. From a helicopter flying at 100 knots on a combat approach, everything about that geometry is different. The aircraft's forward velocity means that any round fired forward of the beam is being launched with the added impulse of the helicopter's speed superimposed on the muzzle velocity of the weapon. Rounds fired to the rear have the helicopter's velocity subtracted. Rounds fired straight down are affected by the descent rate if the helicopter is in a powered descent. Add to this the rotational movement of the aircraft as the pilot banks and turns, the vertical movement of approach and departure, the ground targets that are themselves potentially moving, and the constant vibration of the rotor system being transmitted through the airframe to the gun mount and through the gun mount to the weapon. And you have a system of variables that no formal training could fully account for. You had to learn it by doing it, mission by mission, round by round, until the adjustments became intuitive. In theory, door gunners were trained to fire in short, controlled bursts of 5 to 7 rounds, pausing briefly after each burst to assess impact, correct aim, and then fire again. This was the doctrine. It conserved ammunition, gave the gunner information about where his rounds were going, and prevented the barrel from overheating. In practice, in the middle of a hot LZ insertion with tracers coming up from the tree line on all sides and the pilot screaming into the intercom and your own adrenaline running so high that your hands aren't quite your own anymore, those careful 5-round bursts had a tendency to become long, sweeping hoses of fire across everything that looked threatening. Experienced gunners knew this about themselves and prepared for it, both by loading as much ammunition as possible and by practicing the discipline of controlled fire until it was as close to automatic as human behavior could be. But even the most experienced gunner in the worst moments sometimes found himself riding the trigger long past the point where doctrine said to stop. The doctrine didn't get shot at. The gunner did. The protection available to door gunners was, to put it charitably, inadequate. To put it accurately, it was barely better than nothing. The fundamental problem was weight. A helicopter's lifting capacity was a fixed quantity determined by its engine output and rotor design, and every pound of armour you added to the airframe was a pound less of fuel, weapons, ammunition, or personnel that the aircraft could carry. The weight budgets were brutal and unforgiving. The Army and Bell's engineers spent considerable effort trying to find ways to provide some protection for crew members without critically compromising the aircraft's performance, and the solutions they arrived at reflected those constraints in ways that anyone who has ever been shot at would find darkly ironic. Flak jackets were issued to all helicopter crew members, but the standard flak jacket of the Vietnam era was designed to protect against artillery shell fragments, not direct weapons fire. The nylon and fiberglass construction that made it effective against low-velocity shrapnel was essentially worthless against an AK-47 round, which would punch through it without meaningful deceleration. The jacket also added weight, a meaningful concern when you were already wearing a flight suit, a flight helmet, a survival vest, a weapon, and potentially additional equipment. And in the heat of the Vietnamese lowlands, it made the wearer significantly hotter, adding to the physiological stress of already demanding conditions. Many door gunners wore them anyway on the theory that some protection against fragments was better than none. Others didn't bother. The chicken plates, officially the air crew body armour, but universally known by the nickname that captured both their shape and the attitude of crew members toward wearing them, were a step up in protection. These were large ceramic composite armour plates designed to cover the front of the torso, capable of stopping small arms fire that would pass through a standard flak jacket. They were rated to defeat 7.62mm ball ammunition under certain conditions, which made them considerably more effective protection than the flak jacket against the AK-47 and SKS carbine rounds that were the most common threat from Viet Cong infantry. The problem was that they weighed around 8.5 pounds. They were bulky enough to restrict movement in the cramped door position, and they only covered the front of the torso. Around from below and to the side, perfectly plausible geometry when enemy ground troops were firing up at an aircraft on approach could easily bypass the plate entirely. The nickname itself told you everything about the institutional attitude. Calling them chicken plates implied that wearing them was something slightly less than courageous, a concession to fear that the real hard men didn't need. It was exactly the kind of toxic machismo that got people killed. And it did. The flight helmet offered some ballistic protection as well, and the built-in intercom system was operationally essential, but the helmet was primarily a communications device, rather than a protective one. Its ballistic rating was meaningful against fragments, but significantly less so against direct fire, and the face remained largely exposed. Door gunners who survived multiple tours of combat flying often described a fatalistic relationship with their vulnerability that was almost philosophical in its acceptance. Not because they didn't value their lives, but because any realistic accounting of their situation showed that there was simply no way to make the job safe, and that trying to pretend otherwise was a form of denial that would interfere with doing the job. The protection was what it was. The mission was what it was. You put on your gear, you climbed into your doorway, and you flew. The relationship between the door gunner and his ammunition was almost intimate in its complexity. The linked belts of 7.62mm ammunition were stored in metal cans or improvised cloth containers, fed into the M60 through the receiver's feed system in a way that required constant management during sustained fire. The belt had a tendency to twist or kink if not handled properly, and a kink in the belt at the wrong moment, particularly if it caught in the feed pole as the gun was cycling, could cause a stoppage that took several seconds to clear. In the middle of a hot LZ with the aircraft on the ground and rounds coming in from the tree line, several seconds was an eternity. Experienced door gunners developed elaborate systems for managing their belts, the way they coiled them in their storage containers, the angle at which the belt entered the receiver, the way they guided it with one hand while firing with the other, that were individual and personal, passed from experienced gunners to new men the way craftsmen pass specialized knowledge to apprentices. Every fifth round being a tracer was a practical compromise with real tactical consequences. Tracer rounds were useful for aiming correction, you could see where your fire was going and adjust, but they also revealed the door gunner's position to the enemy, created a bright visual signature visible from considerable distances, and in dry vegetation or thatched structures could start fires that were sometimes tactically undesirable. Some experienced gunners experimented with changing the tracer ratio, loading 1 in 10 rather than 1 in 5, or in some cases removing tracers entirely for specific mission types where concealment was more important than aiming assistance. This was not authorized procedure, but it happened because the men doing the shooting generally had better insight into the operational trade-offs than the people who set the loading standards. The M60's overheating problem was one of its most serious operational limitations in the door gunner role, and barrel management was a skill that the inexperienced couldn't afford to neglect. The barrel was chrome-lined to reduce wear and friction, but sustained fire, particularly the long bursts that hot LZ operations sometimes demanded, heated the metal to temperatures that could cause the chrome lining to deteriorate, the rifling to erode, and in extreme cases, the barrel itself to warp or crack. The quick-change barrel system was the solution. The crew chief or assistant gunner carried 1 or more spare barrels in a special bag, and when the primary barrel had been fired enough to get hot, the changeover was supposed to happen quickly and cleanly. In practice, the barrel change required removing the hot barrel view, which was hot enough to cause severe burns if handled without the special asbestos glove that was supposed to be part of every door gunner's kit, but sometimes wasn't, and replacing it with the cool spare. In smooth conditions on the ground, a trained crew could do this in under 10 seconds. In a moving aircraft with enemy fire coming in, with the gunner's adrenaline up and his hands potentially not entirely steady, it could take considerably longer, and every second without fire from that position was a second the enemy could exploit. The runaway gun, a M60 that continued firing after the trigger was released, was one of the more alarming malfunctions a door gunner could encounter. It happened because the bolt, heated by sustained fire, could cook off a round in the chamber without the firing pin being driven forward by the trigger mechanism. Once the gun started running away, the only options were to extract the belt from the feed tray to cut off the ammunition supply, or to keep the muzzle pointed somewhere that wouldn't cause friendly fire casualties, while the assistant physically pulled on the belt to stop the feeding. In a helicopter, with the aircraft banking and turning and the gunner trying to maintain his position, controlling a runaway gun while also not shooting your own aircraft or your own troops required both physical strength and a very specific kind of presence of mind that was easier to describe than to maintain. The range of missions that door gunners flew in Vietnam extended well beyond the standard assault and resupply operations that most accounts focus on. One of the less discussed but operationally significant roles was night operations, which expanded dramatically as American forces developed the doctrine and technology to operate effectively in darkness. The Viet Cong had traditionally used the hours of darkness as their primary operating window. They moved supplies, conducted attacks, and held their political meetings at night, correctly calculating that American forces were less effective and less confident in darkness than in daylight. The Army's response was to develop night aviation capability as a priority, fielding specialized equipment including the AN/T VS-2 crew-served night observation device and later more sophisticated systems that allowed helicopter crews to operate with meaningful effectiveness after dark. For door gunners on night missions, the challenges were multiplied in ways that tested every skill they had developed in daylight operations. Target identification, already difficult in the complex civilian military environment of Vietnam, became even more so when the only visual information available was what could be seen through image-intensifying equipment or inferred from tracer fire and muzzle flash. The enemy's green tracers were actually helpful in this respect. They showed you where fire was coming from, which at least gave you something to respond to. But the ambient light levels in the Vietnamese countryside at night, far from the lit-up cities, were often genuinely very low, and operating a machine gun from an open helicopter doorway against targets you were identifying primarily by muzzle flash required a kind of combat judgment that came only from extensive experience. The psychological challenge of night operations deserves separate consideration. Human beings are not natural nocturnal hunters. Our visual systems are optimized for daylight. Our orientation reflexes depend on visible horizon cues that disappear in darkness, and our threat detection instincts, calibrated by evolution for ground-level encounters, were not well suited to the aerial combat environment at night. Door gunners flying night missions described a specific quality of fear different from daytime combat. More disorienting, more uncertain, with the particular dread of not being able to see the threat before it arrived. The sound of a round passing close by, the impact of something hitting the aircraft structure, the sudden darkness of a hit to the electrical system. All of these were more frightening at night because there was no visual context to help process what was happening. The integration of door gunners into the broader combined arms team, the coordination of their fire with artillery, with Air Force tactical aircraft, with naval gunfire in coastal operations, and with the fire of ground troops, was one of the operational achievements of the airmobile concept that is sometimes overlooked in favor of the more dramatic individual-level narratives. Fire coordination in Vietnam was managed through an elaborate system of fire control networks, clearance procedures, and communication protocols designed to prevent different elements of the American firepower complex from killing each other in the confusion of combat. In theory, no helicopter could fire without clearance from the appropriate authority. In practice, when the aircraft was under fire, the door gunner's response was immediate and the clearance request came afterward, if at all. The coordination was real and important at the operational level, but at the tactical level, it yielded to the immediate demands of survival and mission accomplishment. The AH-1. Cobra's introduction in 1967 changed the door gunner's operational environment in significant ways. The Cobra was the Army's first purpose-built attack helicopter, a slim tandem-seat aircraft with a stub wing that carried rocket pods and miniguns, and a nose turret that could be fitted with either a 7.62mm minigun or a 40mm grenade launcher, or a combination of both. Unlike the armed UH-1 gunships that had been the standard attack platform until then, the Cobra was optimized for speed and maneuverability in the attack role, with a maximum speed of about 150 knots compared to the Huey gunship's 120 knots, and a much smaller frontal profile that made it a harder target from the ground. With the Cobra flying gun cover, the UH-1 slick crews and their door gunners had significantly better air cover during assault operations because the Cobra's gun systems could engage enemy anti-aircraft positions more effectively and at greater range than the door guns of the escort UH-1 gunships had been able to, but the Cobra didn't. The Cobra replaced the door gunner. It complemented him. The Cobra and the lift ships operated as a team, the Cobras making firing runs to suppress known enemy positions, while the Slicks carried the troops into the LZ, the door gunners providing close-in defensive fire during the most vulnerable phases of the landing when the Cobras had to pull off their runs to avoid flying through the final approach path. The coordination between the gun teams and the lift platoons was sophisticated and required sustained practice to execute well, and units that had been operating together for months achieved a level of tactical integration that newly arrived replacements couldn't approximate. This was one of the reasons why the Army's individual replacement system, which rotated individual soldiers into and out of units on a 12-month schedule rather than rotating whole units together, was so costly in terms of effectiveness. Every time a key crew member rotated out, the carefully developed team chemistry had to be rebuilt from scratch with his replacement. The specific experience of flying in the UH-1, the Huey itself, deserves some attention because the aircraft's characteristics shape the door gunner's experience in ways that pure technical specifications don't capture. The Huey's cargo compartment was approximately 66 inches wide, 106 inches long and 58 inches tall, large enough to carry 8 or 9 combat-loaded infantry soldiers in reasonable discomfort, or to accept a medical litter configuration, or to carry a combination of cargo and passengers. With the sliding doors on both sides removed, as was standard operating procedure in combat to allow the door gunners unrestricted fields of fire, the compartment was essentially open to the atmosphere, which meant that the door gunners were not just at the doors, but were functionally outside the aircraft for most of their working time. The Huey's rotor system generated that unique rhythmic sound, whop, 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 that became the acoustic signature of the entire Vietnam War, reproduced in film soundtracks and news broadcasts until it became inseparable from the war's identity in the public imagination. For door gunners and other helicopter crews, the sound had a more practical meaning. It was the continuous background noise of their working environment, loud enough to require helmet communication systems for any conversation with the rest of the crew, vibrating through the airframe with enough energy that skilled crew members could read changes in the rotor note the way a mechanic reads engine noise, picking up subtle shifts that might indicate an incipient mechanical problem. The rotor wash on the ground, the powerful downwash from the spinning blades, was strong enough to knock down standing men at close range, flatten tall grass, and stir up enough dust in dry conditions to create temporary local brownouts that grounded aircraft and provided the enemy with convenient smoke screens for approaches to LZ perimeters. Living with these operational realities over the course of a 12-month tour was a process of continual adaptation that affected every door gunner differently but left marks on all of them. The physical toll was significant. The noise, the vibration, the physical exertion of managing a machine gun in flight for 6 to 8 hours a day, the interrupted sleep of forward operations where the next mission could come at any hour. But it was the psychological accumulation that most survivors emphasize when describing what the experience was like. Every mission added to a running total of experiences, decisions, outcomes, and memories that couldn't be set aside when the aircraft landed, couldn't be switched off when the day's flying was done. The cup filled, slowly or quickly depending on the intensity of operations, and the men who managed best were those who found ways to process what they were accumulating rather than simply trying to suppress it. Now, let's get into what the actual combat experience of a door gunner looked like, because the training and the equipment and the doctrine only take you so far before you have to reckon with the reality of what these men were doing every single day in Vietnam. And the reality was something that no amount of preparation could fully account for. Imagine you're on approach to a landing zone in the Ia Drang Valley in November 1965. You're in the right door of a UH-1D, one of 8 Hueys in a flight carrying a company of infantry from the 1st Battalion, 7th Cavalry Regiment, the same unit that Custer led to its destruction at the Little Bighorn, and the men in the unit were very much aware of that history. The LZ, designated Landing Zone X-Ray, is a clearing roughly 100 meters by 100 meters, carved out of the tall elephant grass at the base of the Chupong Massif, a rugged mountain range running along the Cambodian border that intelligence reports suggest is riddled with North Vietnamese Army base camps. The intelligence reports are right. There are somewhere between 1,600 and 2,000 North Vietnamese regular soldiers within a few kilometers of where your helicopter is about to land. The flight leader calls 30 seconds on the radio, and your helicopter begins its descent. You're at about 150 feet, slowing from 80 knots, the approach angle bringing you down in a long, shallow glide toward that clearing. Your left hand is on the pistol grip of the M60, your right hand is braced against the fuselage, and you're watching the tree line at the south end of the clearing with an intensity that feels like it might actually cause physical pain. The grass is tall enough that you can't see ground level from your position. The trees are dense and dark and absolutely still. The pilots are talking quietly on the intercom about their approach heading and their flare point. The troops in the back are checking their weapons one last time, and you can hear it behind you, the metallic clicking and clacking of 30 men making sure a round is chambered and the safety is off. And then the tree line opens up. The first thing you see is the muzzle flash from the left side of the clearing. About 150 meters out, several flashes in rapid succession from a position in the grass that you wouldn't have been able to identify as anything other than grass. Half a second ago, you're already rotating the gun, already squeezing the trigger, the M60 hammering against your grip as you lay the first burst into the flash point. The pilots are reacting. You feel the helicopter twist slightly as the pilot pushes forward on the cyclic, trying to build airspeed, but you're too close to the LZ and too committed to the approach to abort cleanly, so you're going in. More muzzle flashes, from the tree line to the right now. You swing the gun right, another burst, then back left, because there's movement in the grass and you need to keep the left side suppressed. The helicopter flares hard at the last moment and the skids hit the grass with a thump that you feel through your boots. The troops are pouring out the back and sides before the aircraft has fully settled, and you're still firing, sweeping the tree line, trying to keep any heads down that were thinking about coming up. You're at about 300 rounds used now, and you can feel the barrel starting to get warm even through the handle. The troops are running into the grass, spreading out, taking fire and returning it, and in 15 seconds the helicopter is lifting off again. Empty, lighter, faster, and you're climbing out of the LZ on a departure, heading away from the worst of the fire, while the next Huey in the flight is already beginning its approach behind you. That 15 seconds on the ground was about as compressed an experience of mortal danger as the human nervous system can process. And for door gunners who flew in the Ia Drang between November 14th and 18th, 1965, that sequence repeated itself over and over and over again, because the fight at LZ X-Ray and the subsequent ambush at LZ Albany, where a 400-man American battalion was cut to pieces by NVA forces while moving between landing zones, was the most intense, sustained combat that American forces had yet experienced in Vietnam. More than 230 American soldiers were killed in those 5 days. Dozens of helicopters were hit by ground fire. Several were shot down. The door gunners who flew those missions fired tens of thousands of rounds, and in many cases were the difference between a successful extraction and a catastrophe. The Battle of Ia Drang was a turning point in multiple senses. It proved that the airmobile concept worked, that helicopter-borne forces could be moved rapidly enough and supported heavily enough to engage even large, well-organized NVA formations and fight them to a tactical draw or better. It also proved that the cost would be brutal and that the enemy was not going to be intimidated by American helicopters the way earlier doctrine had sometimes assumed. The NVA learned quickly from Drang that the optimal tactic against American airmobile forces was to grab them by the belt, to close into such tight contact with American troops that the advantage of American firepower, including door guns and artillery and airstrikes, was neutralized by the risk of killing friendly troops. This tactic showed up repeatedly in subsequent major engagements and forced constant tactical adjustments from American helicopter crews and their ground force commanders. For the door gunner, the practical consequence of the enemy's tactical learning was that engagements became more complicated, more ambiguous, and more psychologically demanding. The Viet Cong and NVA learned to stay close to civilians, to operate in and among populated villages, to use the civilian population as both cover and resource. They learned to disguise their fighters as farmers, to store weapons in rice paddies and hayricks, to use children as lookouts and couriers. And all of this made the door gunner's already difficult job of identifying legitimate targets and distinguishing combatants from non-combatants essentially impossible in many situations. You are flying at 80 knots at 100 feet altitude. You have approximately 3 seconds to look at any given piece of ground as you pass over it. In those 3 seconds, you have to decide whether the figure in the black pajamas running from the tree line is a Viet Cong fighter who just heard your helicopter and is running to his weapon, or a farmer who heard your helicopter and is running to get away from the noise. You get it wrong sometimes. Everyone did. And living with having gotten it wrong was one of the psychological weights that door gunners carried long after they came home. The hot landing zone, what crews abbreviated simply as HOT LZ, was the defining experience of the door gunner's combat life. A HOT LZ was a landing zone that was under enemy fire during the landing operation, which meant that the helicopters were flying into known or suspected enemy contact to insert or extract troops. The decision to insert into a HOT LZ was made by commanders at various levels and was typically based on the tactical necessity of getting troops into or out of a specific position quickly enough that waiting for the enemy fire to be suppressed was not an option. HOT LZs were not rare events in Vietnam. For units operating in heavily contested areas, they were routine. The 1st Cavalry Division, the 101st Airborne Division, the 25th Infantry Division, and the Marine Helicopter units all experienced periods during their Vietnam deployments when HOT LZ operations were simply part of the daily rhythm. The door gunner's role during a HOT LZ insertion was specific and demanding. As the flight approached the landing zone, typically in a column formation with aircraft spaced about 200 to 300 meters apart, the lead aircraft was most exposed, drawing the initial fire before the enemy had been suppressed by the gunships orbiting the LZ. Door gunners in all the troop-carrying Hueys were firing continuously from about 300 meters out, trying to suppress enemy positions around the perimeter of the clearing. The gunships made firing runs on identified enemy positions, and the combination of all this fire was meant to suppress the enemy long enough for the troop aircraft to land, offload, and depart. In a well-coordinated assault against a lightly armed enemy who hadn't prepared their positions well, this worked more or less as advertised. In a well-prepared NVA ambush against a flight with good fire discipline and experienced crews, it was a running fight that sometimes lasted the entire time on the LZ and occasionally longer. One of the most decorated door gunner actions of the entire war took place on May 8, 1967, when Specialist 5 Lawrence Joel was awarded the Medal of Honor. But Joel was a medic, not a gunner. The door gunner community had its own heroes, men like Specialist 4 Gary Wetzel of the 173rd Assault Helicopter Company, who was awarded the Medal of Honor for actions on January 8, 1968 near Ap Dong, Vietnam. Wetzel's Huey was on final approach to an LZ when it came under intense enemy fire from all sides. The aircraft was hit multiple times, and Wetzel, in the right door, took multiple gunshot wounds in his left arm, which was essentially destroyed by the impacts, with rounds still coming. Into the aircraft, with blood pouring from wounds that would have incapacitated most men, Wetzel maintained his position and continued firing his M60, suppressing the enemy positions that had hit his aircraft and protecting the rest of the crew long enough for them to extract from the LZ. He was later told that he had lost so much blood that his survival was itself something of a medical miracle. He received the Medal of Honor in 1968. He kept his arm barely after multiple surgeries, but never recovered full function. Wetzel's story was extraordinary but not unique in its basic shape. There were dozens of documented cases of severely wounded door gunners continuing to fight, continuing to protect their aircraft and crew through wounds that by any rational assessment should have taken them out of the fight. Part of this was the specific biochemistry of extreme combat stress, the massive adrenaline and cortisol surge that suppresses pain perception and temporarily amplifies physical performance in ways that seem almost impossible afterward. Part of it was the particular psychological reality of the door gunner position. If you stop firing, the aircraft gets hit harder. If the aircraft gets hit hard enough, everyone dies. The incentive structure of the door gunner role made continuing to fight through wounds not merely heroic but operationally necessary, and the men who flew those missions understood that with a clarity that didn't require bravery to be recognized, though what they did with that understanding certainly did. The medical evacuation mission, Medevac, deserves particular attention because it placed door gunners in a moral and tactical situation unlike almost anything else in the Vietnam War. The Medevac Hueys, typically operating under the call sign "Dust Off," flew with a large red cross on a white background painted on both sides of the fuselage and on the nose. Under the Geneva Conventions, a clearly marked medical aircraft was entitled to protection from attack, and the Medevac crews operated on the assumption, or at least the hope, that this protection would be observed. The Viet Cong and NVA observed it sometimes and ignored it other times, depending on the tactical situation and the local commander's judgment. In practice, the Red Cross sometimes served as a beacon for enemy fire rather than a protection against it, and Medevac crews learned to approach their work without illusions about the protection their markings provided. The moral dimension was this: Medevac aircraft were specifically restricted from carrying weapons for offensive purposes under the Geneva Convention rules. The door gunners on Medevac Hueys were supposed to be there strictly for defensive purposes, to suppress enemy fire during the approach and departure if the aircraft was attacked. They were not supposed to be making offensive firing runs or engaging targets of opportunity. In the conditions of Vietnam, this distinction was almost impossible to maintain in practice because the line between enemy shooting at my aircraft and enemy that I am going out of my way to engage was blurred by speed, distance, and the general chaos of combat to the point where it was sometimes visible only in retrospect, if at all. Medevac crews lived in this ethical no man's land throughout the war, doing what they believed was necessary to accomplish their mission and protect their crews while knowing that some of what they were doing occupied a grey area that formal rules couldn't fully account for. What the Medevac missions looked like from the door gunner's position was something like this: a ground unit in contact calls for a dust-off. They're taking casualties and the wounded need immediate evacuation, or they will die. The Medevac crew launches, typically without fighter escort because there isn't time or because none is available, and flies to the unit's position while the battle is still ongoing. The landing zone is wherever the ground commander has designated, sometimes a clear field behind the fighting positions, sometimes a tiny jungle clearing that the helicopter can barely fit into, sometimes literally in the middle of the contact area because there's nowhere else to go. The door gunner scans continuously during the entire approach. He may see muzzle flashes and return fire. He may see nothing and be hit anyway by a rifleman in the tree line who saw the red cross from 400 meters away and decided it was a target. The aircraft lands. Medical personnel or the troops themselves load the wounded, sometimes 2, sometimes 4, sometimes 6 men, in conditions that exceed the aircraft's published load limits because the alternative is leaving men to die. The door gunner is still firing. The pilot lifts off. The aircraft departs heavier and slower than it arrived, the door gunner still watching the tree line until the clearing is below the horizon, and they're flying between terrain features at low altitude back toward the nearest surgical facility. The dust-off crews flew some of the most dangerous missions in the entire war, and their door gunners were integral to their survival. Major Charles Kelly, the officer who essentially established the doctrine and culture of the dust-off mission in Vietnam, was killed on July 1st, 1964, when his aircraft was shot down on a medevac mission. His last transmission, as he hovered over a contested position to take on casualties while ground fire was coming into the aircraft, was the phrase that became the unofficial motto of the dust-off community. "When I have your wounded." The Army's medevac helicopters are still known as dust-off today, and that tradition flows directly from those men and those missions. One story that circulated among door gunner crews and has been told and retold in the decades since involved a young gunner on a routine insertion mission in the Central Highlands, who was perhaps 19 or 20 years old, relatively new in country, still learning the rhythms of combat flying. His helicopter had just completed a sweep of a suspected Viet Cong position, and the gunners believed they had neutralized the enemy force in the area. When the aircraft landed to assess the results, as crews sometimes did when the tactical situation permitted, this young door gunner noticed that one of the enemy soldiers was still alive, wounded but conscious, lying in the grass where he had been hit. Without saying anything to the rest of the crew, acting on some impulse that he couldn't explain and probably couldn't fully account for, even years later, he unfastened his monkey strap and jumped out of his door position to help the wounded man. He landed, turned around and realized that nobody had seen him leave. His helicopter was already lifting off the ground, turning to depart, the rest of the crew completely unaware that one of their number was no longer aboard. He stood there for about 30 minutes, an eternity in those circumstances, alone in the middle of what had just been a combat zone, unarmed because he'd left his sidearm in the aircraft, next to a wounded enemy soldier who was probably in no condition to threaten him, but was definitely a reminder of where he was and what had just happened in that clearing. When his crew finally realized that the right door gun was unmanned and nobody had seen the gunner since the landing, they turned around and went back. He was still there. He hadn't been touched. The wounded enemy soldier was still alive and was subsequently taken prisoner. The gunner, upon returning to base, received a combination of thorough dressing down for his breach of procedure and a degree of grudging admiration for having done something that nobody could quite categorize as either foolish or noble. It was simply human, in a context where being human was an unusual and sometimes dangerous luxury. Another incident, different in its outcome, involved a door gunner who fell out of his helicopter during an evasive maneuver. The monkey strap had not been properly secured, or the attachment point failed under load. The details vary depending on who tells the story, but the result was that the man went out the door at low altitude over what was believed to be a cleared area. He fell perhaps 40 or 50 feet, which is enough to kill you if you land wrong, but he landed in tall grass that partly absorbed the impact, and he landed directly on top of two Viet Cong soldiers who had been lying in that grass, concealed, waiting for whatever opportunity presented itself. The collision was apparently as much of a shock to the enemy soldiers as it was to the door gunner. He recovered first the training, the adrenaline, the instinct, grabbed one of their weapons and dealt with the situation before either of them could recover from the surprise. Then he waited in that grass for his helicopter to come back, which it did once the crew sorted out what had happened. For actions that no after-action report could have predicted or planned for, he received a decoration for bravery. The recommendations cited his initiative and aggressiveness in the face of the enemy. The incident became one of those stories that spread through the helicopter community and eventually became part of the mythology of the door gunner role. The proof that in this particular job, the unexpected wasn't the exception, but the rule, and that surviving it sometimes required capabilities that no training program could instill. The psychological weight of the door gunner's experience accumulated in ways that the army of the 1960s was thoroughly unprepared to address. The concept of combat stress had been recognized since at least World War I, when it was called shell shock, and the lessons of that conflict in World War II had produced a modest body of clinical knowledge about what happened to men who were subjected to sustained extreme stress and violence. But the institutional army of the Vietnam era remained deeply ambivalent about that knowledge, caught between the clinical evidence that combat stress was a real and serious medical condition and the cultural assumption that admitting to stress was a form of weakness that undermined unit cohesion and combat effectiveness. The result was that men who were struggling psychologically were often expected to simply continue flying, continue fighting until their tour ended and they went home, at which point the problem was officially someone else's to deal with. Veterans have described the psychological experience of sustained door gunner duty in ways that are remarkably consistent across decades and across different units. 90% of their missions were, in their words, endlessly boring. The helicopter droning along over jungle that looked the same from one horizon to the other, hour after hour, the occasional village or rice paddy breaking the green monotony, the pilot making small talk on the intercom, or going silent, the crew chief dozing against the bulkhead. And then the other 10% was something else entirely. The transition from boredom to combat was almost instantaneous. You went from staring at jungle to being in the middle of a firefight without any intermediate state, without any ramp-up period, without any of the anticipatory warning signals that ground-based soldiers sometimes had when an ambush was being prepared. The helicopter was either not in contact or in contact, and the transition between those states was measured in fractions of a second. This pattern of extreme stress, interspersed with long periods of relative calm but persistent low-grade vigilance, produced a specific kind of psychological strain that differs from both sustained combat experience and purely episodic trauma. The door gunner could never fully relax on a mission, even when nothing was happening, because nothing happening was not the same as nothing about to happen. The jungle never told you in advance what it was going to do, so the vigilance had to be maintained continuously, and the cost of that maintenance was paid in cortisol and adrenaline and the slow depletion of whatever reserves the human nervous system has for tolerating sustained uncertainty and danger. Almost all helicopter crew members who flew extended tours in Vietnam saw friends and fellow crew members die beside them. This is not a rhetorical statement about the general tragedy of war. It is a literal description of the physical reality of dying in a helicopter. When a crewmate was hit, he was a few feet away from you. When the aircraft went down, you went down with everyone else aboard. The shared danger and the shared trauma of those experiences created bonds between crew members that veterans consistently describe as the most intense of their lives, and the losses they sustained were felt with a corresponding intensity. The grief and the guilt, why him and not me, and the anger and the numbness that follow sustained loss were the psychological landscape of the door gunner's inner life, and most of them carried that landscape home with them when their tours ended. The specific dynamics of the Tet Offensive as it affected helicopter crews and door gunners deserve more detailed examination than they often receive in accounts that focus on the political impact or the ground battles in the cities. When the offensive began in the early morning hours of January 31st, 1968, helicopter crews throughout South Vietnam were suddenly operating in a completely different environment from anything they had experienced before. The attacks hit simultaneously in over 100 locations across the country, including the approaches to multiple major American air bases and aviation facilities. At Tan Son Nhut Air Base outside Saigon, Bien Hoa and other facilities, the initial attacks targeted aviation assets directly, mortar fire and rocket attacks aimed at aircraft on the flight line, sapper attacks on fuel and ammunition storage, ground assaults on the base perimeters. For the helicopter crews, many of whom were woken from sleep by the sound of explosions and found themselves scrambling to get their aircraft in the air before they were destroyed on the ground, the first hours of Tet were a desperate improvisation. The door gunners who flew during the Tet Offensive were operating in urban and semi-urban environments that presented challenges very different from the jungle warfare that had defined most of their previous experience. Flying low over the streets of Saigon, Hue, Ben Tre, or any of the other cities that were simultaneously contested, the door gunner faced a target identification problem that was essentially insoluble in real time. The streets were full of people, many of them civilians who were themselves trying to escape the fighting, mixed with ARVN soldiers, American advisors, Viet Cong fighters, and NVA regulars, all of them in motion, all of them in the same physical space, none of them wearing identifying markers that were visible from a helicopter at any useful tactical distance. The collateral damage that occurred during Tet, both from American and ARVN fire and from NVA and VC actions, was enormous, and the door gunner's contribution to that damage was real, however unavoidable it may have been given the conditions. The siege of Hue lasted 30 days and involved some of the most intense urban fighting of the entire war. The Marines and ARVN units fighting house to house through the ancient city's streets were supported by helicopter operations that kept them supplied and evacuated their wounded, but the close-quarters nature of the battle limited what helicopters could do offensively. A door gunner firing into a built-up area where friendly and enemy forces were sometimes in the same building on different floors was operating at the absolute edge of what was tactically and morally manageable. The units that maintained their discipline and professionalism under those conditions deserve credit that is sometimes lost in the broader narratives of Tet's political significance. The question of friendly fire, what the military calls fratricide, was a constant anxiety for door gunners throughout the war, and it deserves honest examination, because the suppression of that anxiety was itself a significant part of the psychological burden these men carried. In the confused, fast-moving conditions of airmobile operations, where friendly troops were frequently moving through jungle terrain that looked identical from above to terrain occupied by the enemy, where smoke and fire and the disorientation of combat made location identification extremely difficult, and where the decision-making window for a door gunner was measured in fractions of a second, mistakes happened. Good men made bad decisions. Correct decisions sometimes had terrible outcomes, and the door gunners who lived with the knowledge that their fire had on some occasion hit the wrong target, friendly troops, civilians, people who were not what the situation had led the gunner to believe they were, carried that knowledge for the rest of their lives. The army had protocols designed to minimize friendly fire incidents. Smoke grenades in specific colors to mark friendly positions, radio communications confirming the locations of friendly units before fire was opened, ground panels visible from the air to identify friendly troops to aircraft overhead. These protocols worked in training exercises and in well-coordinated planned operations. They worked less well in the chaos of a hot LZ with radio traffic filling all the frequencies, smoke drifting in unexpected directions because of wind or because the enemy had picked up the protocols and started using similar smoke colors, ground panels obscured by vegetation or removed during movement. The door gunner who relied entirely on the protocols was safer from friendly fire incidents but potentially less effective against the enemy. The door gunner who ignored them and fired freely was more dangerous to the enemy and more dangerous to his own side. Most experienced gunners navigated this trade-off through a combination of practiced judgment, constant situational awareness, and a willingness to check fire even when it cost time and tactical advantage. The NVA's targeting of door gunners specifically, not just shooting at helicopters generally, but specifically aiming at the men in the doorways, was a documented tactical practice that became more systematic as the war progressed, and NVA commanders accumulated experience against American airmobile forces. The reasoning was straightforward. A door gunner was more exposed than the pilots, who sat behind at least some structural material. Killing or wounding the door gunner degraded the helicopter's immediate defensive capability without necessarily bringing down the aircraft. And the psychological effect of watching a fellow crew member killed or wounded in the doorway was significant and could disrupt crew performance. NVA training materials captured after the war included specific instructions on engaging helicopter crew members, with emphasis on the doorway positions. Snipers were a particular threat. A skilled rifle shot at 300 to 500 meters could hit a door gunner who was occupied with his weapon and not watching for individual shooters, particularly if the aircraft was in a predictable, slow phase of flight during approach or landing. The door gunner's helmet provided some protection against fragments but not against a direct rifle hit. His flak jacket, as we've established, was not designed to stop rifle rounds. His chicken plate, if he was wearing it, covered his front but not his sides or back. A sniper who could get a clean shot from a tree line at the right angle had a genuine opportunity to make a kill, and the NVA used that opportunity. The casualty reports from helicopter units throughout the war include a consistent category of crew member wounds that pattern matches sniper engagements, single gunshot wounds to the head, neck, or upper torso at moments when the aircraft was at low altitude in the approach or departure phase. The CASVAC, casualty evacuation, missions that door gunners flew were among the most psychologically demanding of all their duties. Not because of the danger, though the danger was very real, but because of what they carried back from those missions. A Huey flying back from a hot LZ with dead and wounded aboard was a specific kind of experience that veterans describe with a consistency that suggests it reached a deeper level of psychological processing than the more abstract fact of combat. The smell of blood in the confines of the aircraft, the sounds of wounded men, the faces of the dead, these were not distant or abstract. They were close, immediate, present in the same small space where you were trying to do your job, and they were the human consequence of everything that the mission required. Many door gunners developed what psychologists would later recognize as symptoms of acute stress response during their tours, and the unit response to these symptoms varied enormously depending on the leadership culture and the specific individuals involved. Some units had experienced senior NCOs, or officers who understood, at an intuitive level if not a clinical one, when a man had reached his limit and needed to be stood down for a period. Others operated by the principle that weakness was contagious and that keeping everyone flying regardless of their psychological state was the only way to maintain operational effectiveness. The latter approach produced short-term results at long-term cost. Men who kept flying when they should have been stood down sometimes made the mistakes that got crews killed because the cognitive and emotional resources required for the job had been depleted past the point of safe function. The camaraderie that developed among helicopter crews, and specifically among door gunners who formed their own informal community within the broader helicopter world, was one of the genuine human goods that emerged from the experience of Vietnam. The bonds between men who had shared this specific kind of danger, who had protected each other in ways that went beyond the formal requirements of military service, who had seen each other at the absolute limits of what human beings can endure and found that the person next to them was still standing. These bonds were profound and lasting. Veterans from the same units continued to maintain contact decades after the war, gathering at reunions, keeping track of each other's lives, and providing support through the difficulties of the post-war years with a loyalty that the war had forged and time hadn't diminished. The dark humour that emerged in helicopter units, as in any sustained combat environment, was a survival mechanism that sometimes shocked civilians but made perfect sense in context. The jokes about close calls, about mechanical malfunctions, about the improbable events that constituted ordinary experience in this extraordinary job, these were not signs of callousness or indifference to danger. They were signs of human beings maintaining their psychological equilibrium in conditions that would otherwise be unmanageable. The door gunner who joked about his monkey strap was not denying the danger of his position. He was processing it in the only way available that didn't require him to fully inhabit the fear every minute of every mission, which would have been paralyzing. The humour was a pressure release valve for an experience that couldn't be talked about directly in the military culture of the time. And it served its function, imperfectly and incompletely, as such mechanisms always do. By 1967, the war in Vietnam had escalated to a scale that even the most pessimistic early planners hadn't anticipated. American troop levels had climbed above 400,000 and were still rising. The helicopter fleet had grown from a few hundred aircraft in 1962 to more than 4,000, making Vietnam by an enormous margin the most helicopter-intensive conflict in the history of warfare. And the enemy had responded to American air power in the way that adversaries throughout history have responded to military technologies that initially give one side a decisive advantage. They adapted, they improvised, and they developed countermeasures that turned the American advantage into a more complicated and costly equation. The NVA's anti-aircraft capability in 1965 had consisted primarily of small arms, AK-47s, SKS carbines, RPD light machine guns that could damage unarmoured helicopters but required either precise marksmanship or very high volume of fire to reliably bring one down. By 1967, that picture had changed substantially. The North Vietnamese and Viet Cong were deploying dedicated anti-aircraft weapons in much greater numbers, including the Soviet-designed 12.7mm DSHK heavy machine gun, essentially the Soviet equivalent of the American .50 caliber M2HB, and increasingly the 23mm ZDU 23-2 twin-barrel automatic cannon, which was an order of magnitude more dangerous to helicopters than small arms. The ZU-23-2 could fire at a cyclic rate of approximately 400 rounds per minute per barrel, or 800 rounds per minute for both barrels together, and its 23mm rounds were large enough that a single hit in the right place could bring down even a robust helicopter immediately. At the ranges at which helicopter operations were typically conducted, low and slow, the ZU-23-2 was effectively a door gunner's worst nightmare made of steel and propellant. The NVA also began deploying the SA-7 Grail shoulder-fired surface-to-air missile in larger numbers from around 1972, giving individual infantry soldiers a weapon that could engage helicopters at ranges of up to 5,500 meters and altitudes up to about 4,500 meters. The SA-7 was an infrared homing missile that tracked the heat signature of the helicopter's exhaust, which meant it could engage aircraft that were attempting to evade by maneuvering or flying low, the tactics that had been developed against unguided weapons. Several American helicopters were shot down by SA-7s during the final years of American involvement, and the threat they represented fundamentally changed the way helicopter crews had to think about their exposure profiles during missions. Against this evolving threat environment, the door gunner's job became more dangerous every year. The cumulative aircraft loss statistics for American helicopters in Vietnam are sobering by any measure. Over the course of the entire war, the United States lost approximately 5,086 helicopters to all causes, of which roughly 2,382 were destroyed as a result of hostile action and another 2,704 were lost in operational accidents. The hostile loss figure alone, nearly 2,400 aircraft, represents an almost incomprehensible attrition rate for a weapons system that had only existed in practical military form for about 20 years at the time. The human cost behind those numbers was proportional. Thousands of pilots, crew chiefs, door gunners, and passengers killed or wounded in aircraft that were shot down or crashed. The door gunner's personal casualty rate within that larger statistic was among the highest of any crew position in Army aviation. The logic was brutally simple. He was the most exposed member of the crew, he was the most visible target from the ground, and he was usually the member of the crew most consistently in the line of fire during the critical phases of every mission. Exact figures for door gunner casualties are difficult to isolate from the broader aviation casualty statistics because the Army's record-keeping during this period didn't always distinguish cleanly between the different crew positions, but the evidence from unit histories, survivor accounts, and official records consistently indicates that door gunners and crew chiefs who occupied the most exposed positions in the aircraft suffered disproportionate casualties relative to pilots. The Tet Offensive of January 1968 brought the war's intensity to a level that shocked even experienced veterans. The coordinated NVA and Viet Cong attacks on 36 of South Vietnam's 44 provincial capitals, the fighting in Saigon itself, and the prolonged siege of the Marine base at Khe Sanh all placed extraordinary demands on the helicopter fleet and on every member of every helicopter crew. At Khe Sanh, the only reliable way to supply the 6,000-man Marine garrison under siege from January 21st to April 8th, 1968 was by air, and much of that supply operation fell to helicopters operating in conditions that combined enemy anti-aircraft fire, poor weather, restricted airspace, and the navigational challenge of landing in a small, exposed position, surrounded by a large NVA force on all sides. The helicopter crews who flew those resupply missions, including the door gunners providing defensive fire during approach and departure, operated under sustained threat that made even experienced crews re-examine the limits of what human beings could endure. The Battle of Hue, fought during Tet from January 30th to March 2nd, 1968, was a different kind of challenge. The NVA had occupied the ancient imperial capital city and fortified it with the kind of urban defences, building to building, room to room, that helicopters were not well suited to engage. The door gunner in a street-level engagement in Hue was shooting at targets that were sometimes only a few dozen meters away, in some cases looking up at buildings that the enemy held rather than down at open terrain. The dynamics of fire and movement, of identifying targets in a built environment, of avoiding civilian casualties in a densely populated city, all of this was qualitatively different from the jungle and rice paddy operations that had shaped most door gunners' training and experience. The adaptations required were rapid and improvised, and the cost of learning in real time was measured in lives. The spring of 1969 brought Operation Apache Snow, including the engagement known as the Battle of Hamburger Hill, Hill 937 in the A Shau Valley, which became one of the most controversial engagements of the entire war. 10 days of fighting on a heavily fortified NVA position, 72 American soldiers killed and 372 wounded, and then the Army abandoned the hill almost immediately after taking it at such cost. The helicopter operations supporting Hamburger Hill were continuous and costly. Resupply under fire, casualty evacuation from positions so steep and overgrown that landing was barely possible, troop insertions into contact. The door gunners who flew those missions operated in terrain that channeled approach routes in ways that gave the enemy predictable engagement opportunities, meaning that the element of surprise that sometimes protected helicopter crews in more open country was simply not available. You came in from a certain direction because the terrain forced you to, and the enemy knew that and planned accordingly. The American drawdown that followed President Nixon's announcement of Vietnamization in 1969, the gradual transfer of the combat burden to South Vietnamese forces while American troops withdrew, didn't immediately reduced the workload for helicopter crews. If anything, the pace of certain operations increased as American advisors worked to build up ARVN aviation capabilities, and American units conducted operations intended to degrade NVA capability before withdrawal. The number of American helicopters in Vietnam peaked at over 3,900 aircraft in 1969, and the operational tempo remained intense through 1970 and into 1971. At the incursion into Cambodia in May 1970 and the ARVN operation into Laos in February 1971, Operation Lam Son 719, demonstrated both the continuing importance of helicopter operations and the growing sophistication of the enemy's anti-aircraft defenses. Lam Son 719 was particularly costly. The operation was intended to cut the Ho Chi Minh Trail in Laos, and American helicopters were used extensively to support the ARVN ground forces. But the NVA had anticipated the operation and positioned a massive concentration of anti-aircraft weapons along the likely approach routes and in the objective area. Over the course of the operation, which lasted from February 8th to March 25th, 1971, the United States lost approximately 107 helicopters destroyed and another 618 damaged. It was the most costly helicopter operation in the history of American military aviation up to that point, and it demonstrated conclusively that the increasing sophistication of NVA air defenses was fundamentally changing the operational calculus for helicopter employment. For the door gunners who flew in Lam Son 719, the experience was something qualitatively different from what even the most combat-hardened veterans had previously encountered. The density of anti-aircraft fire in the Laotian corridor was extraordinary. Gun crews firing constantly from concealed positions, SA-7s launching from the ridgelines, every approach and departure route covered by multiple overlapping fields of fire. The helicopter losses were visible and constant, aircraft going down in flames, others making emergency landings that were themselves in enemy territory, crews being killed or captured. The psychological effect on the door gunners and other crew members who continued flying under those conditions was considerable, and the unit histories from that period describe a level of sustained stress that exceeded anything previously documented in helicopter aviation. By 1972, the last American combat units were withdrawing from Vietnam, and the role of American door gunners in direct combat operations was effectively ending. The Easter Offensive, launched by North Vietnam in March 1972, a conventional military invasion using tanks, artillery, and infantry divisions, very different in character from the guerrilla war that had dominated the previous decade, was met by South Vietnamese ground forces with American air support but minimal American ground involvement. The helicopter crews still in-country provided advisory support and performed some combat missions, but the era of American door gunners in the frontline role they had occupied since 1962 was drawing to a close. The Paris Peace Accords of January 27, 1973 ended direct American military involvement in Vietnam. The last American combat troops left in March 1973. The door gunners who had flown through the entire arc of the war, from the early advisory period to the intense fighting of the mid-1960s to the grinding endgame of Vietnamization, were left to make their way home and figure out what being home meant after everything they had experienced. The answer, for many of them, was complicated in ways that took years and decades to work through. The reception that Vietnam veterans received when they returned home has been written about extensively and debated just as extensively. Whether it was as bad as the most negative accounts suggest, whether the famous stories of soldiers being spat on at airports were widespread or isolated, whether the American public's opposition to the war was as hostile toward the individual soldiers as collective memory sometimes suggests. What is not debated is that the institutional mechanisms for supporting veterans' psychological recovery from combat trauma were wholly inadequate. Post-traumatic stress disorder wasn't formally recognized as a diagnostic category until 1980, 7 years after American combat involvement ended. In the years between 1973 and 1980, the veterans who were struggling with what we would now recognize as PTSD were often simply told that they needed to get over it, that what they were experiencing was a personal weakness, that real soldiers came home and got on with their lives without making a fuss about what they'd been through. For door gunners specifically, the particular nature of their trauma had dimensions that weren't easily captured even in the eventually developed clinical frameworks for understanding combat PTSD. They had experienced hundreds or thousands of hours of sustained exposure to extreme danger, distributed across a tour of 6 months to a year. They had killed people from the air at ranges where the targets were sometimes clearly human beings and sometimes barely distinguishable shapes in the grass. They had lived with a permanent uncertainty about whether specific shooting decisions had killed combatants or civilians, enemies or innocents, because the conditions of combat flying made certainty impossible in the moment, and retrospective investigation was rarely practical. They had watched friends die within arm's reach and then flown the next mission with the blood not yet washed from the cargo floor. Many door gunner veterans spent years after the war struggling with nightmares, hypervigilance, difficulty in relationships, substance abuse, and the specific kind of moral injury that comes from having participated in violence whose necessity you believed in at the time, but whose results you could never fully account for. The divorce rates among Vietnam veterans, the suicide rates, the rates of homelessness and substance dependency in the years following the war, these statistics are the aggregate expression of individual suffering that every one of those men experienced in his own way. For the door gunners, men who had been among the most consistently exposed to combat of anyone in the entire American military establishment in Vietnam, the burden was often proportional to that exposure. The helicopter crews who survived Vietnam and eventually found their way through the psychological aftermath did so through various paths, some through clinical intervention, some through peer support from other veterans, some through religious faith, some through the simple passage of time and the gradual normalization that civilian life eventually imposed on even the most shattered psyche. The Vietnam Veterans Memorial in Washington, D.C., dedicated in November 1982, was for many of them a watershed moment. The first public national acknowledgement that what they had done and what they had lost deserved recognition rather than apology or embarrassment. Standing at the wall and running a finger along the name of a crew member who had gone down in a helicopter over the A Shau Valley in 1968, or the Central Highlands in 1965, or the Delta in 1971. That was, for many veterans, the beginning of a grieving process that had been deferred for years because there had been no sanctioned space in which to conduct it. The military lessons of Vietnam helicopter operations took a different trajectory. The enormous body of combat experience accumulated between 1961 and 1973 was analysed, debated, and eventually incorporated into a new doctrine of airmobile operations that was fundamentally more sophisticated than anything that existed when the first Hueys landed in Vietnam. The development of the AH-1 Cobra attack helicopter, which entered service in 1967 specifically in response to Vietnam combat experience, was the first step in a progression that eventually led to the AH-64 Apache, a dedicated attack helicopter designed from the ground up for the combined arms battle with target acquisition systems, weapons, survivability features, and crew protection that bore only a distant conceptual relationship to the UH-1 gunships that door gunners had flown in the early years of Vietnam. The Apache's crew sits in tandem in an armoured cockpit, protected by blast shields designed to stop 12.7mm rounds, with a fire control system capable of engaging targets at night in bad weather, and at ranges that make the experience of door gunning from an open Huey doorway seem almost medieval by comparison. The lessons about crew protection were incorporated directly. Every subsequent American military helicopter design gave crew survivability a weight in the design process that it had never received before Vietnam. Crash-worthy seats with energy-absorbing structures, composite armor built into the airframe, improved ballistic protection for critical systems, all of these reflected the specific vulnerabilities that Vietnam combat experience had exposed at great cost. The monkey strap was replaced by proper crew restraint systems. The chicken plate was succeeded by integrated body armor designed into the crew station. The flak jacket gave way to ceramic composite armor that actually stopped the rounds it was supposed to stop. The door gunner of the 21st century, flying in an MH-60 or ACH-47 with modern weapon stations and integrated sensors, is operating in a different technological universe from his counterpart who hung in an open Huey door in 1967. But that technological distance should not create a false impression that the fundamental character of the door gunner's role has fundamentally changed. In Iraq, in Afghanistan, in Somalia, and in a dozen other operational environments in the decades after Vietnam, door gunners, now usually called aerial door gunners or helicopter crew, served weapon operators in the official nomenclature, though door gunner remains the universal vernacular, have continued to occupy essentially the same position in the tactical equation that their Vietnam predecessors did. They provide protection for the aircraft and its passengers during landing and takeoff in contested areas. They engage enemy forces that threaten the aircraft or the mission. They serve as the eyes and ears of the crew against ground threats. And they take the direct human cost of that exposure in the form of casualties, psychological trauma, and the particular moral weight that comes with being the person on the trigger. In Afghanistan, door gunners on CH-47 Chinooks inserting Special Operations Forces into high mountain valleys, and on UH-60 Blackhawks supporting conventional infantry operations in the populated lowlands, confronted an enemy who had learned from the same textbook the Viet Cong had written. One that emphasized patience, concealment, prepared positions, and the exploitation of terrain to negate the advantages of American air power. The IED had replaced the Punji Stake, the RPG-7 had replaced the B-40, but the fundamental dynamics of a human being in an aircraft doorway trying to protect an aircraft from ground fire while identifying legitimate targets in a complex environment full of civilians and combatants indistinguishable from each other, those dynamics were unchanged from what the men of the 229th Assault Helicopter Battalion had faced at Landing Zone X-Ray in November 1965. What remains after the tactical doctrine and the weapon specifications and the unit histories and the casualty statistics have all been accounted for is the irreducible human reality of what these men experienced. When you look at the photographs from Vietnam, the ones taken by combat photographers who flew on the same helicopters, who sat in the same doorways, who looked through their viewfinders at the same jungle that the door gunners were scanning for muzzle flash, you see something consistent across years and units and theatres of operation. You see men who are doing their jobs, young men, most of them, 19 and 20 and 21 years old, with the faces that age gives you and the eyes that this specific kind of work gives you. Not glamorous faces, not heroic faces in the cinematic sense, just faces that have seen what these men have seen and are doing what has to be done. There is old footage from Vietnam, some of it colour and some of it black and white, that shows door gunners at work on their aircraft. They are competent and efficient in the way that people become when they have performed a difficult physical task so many thousands of times that the competence has become unconscious. They scan and they fire and they scan again. They change barrels with practice movements. They feed fresh belts into the receiver without looking at their hands. They call out targets in the clipped, stripped-down language of crews who have communicated in high-noise environments so long that every word is the essential minimum. And in the quiet moments between engagements, if the footage catches those moments, you can sometimes see them watching the jungle scroll past below with an attention that is also a kind of acceptance of the reality of where they are, of what they are doing, of what it costs, and of the fact that they are going to do it again tomorrow. The Vietnam War was called many things: the helicopter war, the television war, the war that America lost, the war that broke the army. It was all of those things, and the door gunners were present at the centre of all of them, in their open doorways at low altitude over the jungle, doing the job that nobody else could do in quite the same way. They were neither purely offensive nor purely defensive. They were neither infantry nor aviators in the pure sense of either term. They occupied a singular position at the intersection of fire and flight that the Vietnam War had created and that no previous conflict had demanded in quite that form. And the price they paid for occupying that position, in blood, in years, in the specific damage that this kind of work does to the human mind and spirit, was real and lasting and deserves to be remembered with the clarity and the honesty that the men themselves, almost without exception, would want applied to their story. When you stand in the Vietnam Veterans Memorial and read those names on the wall, all 58,279 of them, remember that a significant number of those names belong to young men who died in open doorways at altitude over the jungle, doing a job that combined the most primitive and the most modern aspects of human violence in ways that the people who designed the helicopters and wrote the doctrines and issued the orders had not fully anticipated and could not have fully prepared anyone for. They were the door gunners. They hung in those doorways and they did what had to be done. And they did it, day after day, mission after mission, until either their tour ended or it ended the other way. The least we can do is know what it cost. The specific aircraft losses in Lamson 719 had a cascading effect on the psychological state of crews that continued to fly those missions as the operation progressed. When an operation begins and 3 or 4 aircraft are lost on the first day, the crews flying day 2 are processing that information in real time. When the losses continue, when pilots and crew members you ate breakfast with are killed or captured or listed as missing in action, the accumulated weight of those losses shapes every subsequent mission in ways that are difficult to fully convey. The door gunners who flew into the Laotian corridor in the 3rd and 4th weeks of Lamson 719, after the losses had made the operation's costs unmistakably clear, were demonstrating a kind of courage that is quieter and perhaps more demanding than the acute courage of initial combat. The courage of knowing exactly how dangerous something is, and doing it anyway because people you care about need you to. The prisoners of war taken from helicopter crews during Vietnam, pilots and crew members who survived being shot down in enemy-controlled territory and were captured by North Vietnamese or Viet Cong forces, represent another dimension of the door gunner experience that is less discussed than the combat narratives, but was very much present in the consciousness of the men flying those missions. Every door gunner who flew in heavily contested areas understood that being shot down over enemy territory and surviving the crash did not end the danger. It transformed it into something potentially even more prolonged and difficult. The treatment of American prisoners by the North Vietnamese, particularly in the prison camps around Hanoi that became known collectively as the Hanoi Hilton, was in repeated documented violation of the Geneva Conventions, involving systematic torture and deprivation designed to extract military information and public statements of opposition to the war. Crew members who were shot down in South Vietnam or Laos faced different but equally serious risks: capture by Viet Cong units operating under different command structures and with varying degrees of adherence to prisoner treatment protocols, execution in the field if circumstances didn't permit evacuation of prisoners, or rescue by the Combat Search and Rescue Forces, the helicopter-borne para-rescue teams that were themselves among the most decorated and most dangerous missions in the entire war. The CSAR, Combat Search and Rescue, operations that recovered downed helicopter crews, were themselves a testament to the culture of loyalty and mutual obligation that the helicopter community had developed in Vietnam. When a helicopter went down in enemy territory, the response was almost reflexive. Other helicopters would attempt rescue, often at significant risk to themselves, because the alternative, leaving crew members behind in enemy hands or dead on the ground when rescue was possible, was culturally unacceptable. The famous rescue of Roger Locker in May 1972 was an Air Force operation, but the same ethos drove Army helicopter rescue attempts throughout the war. Door gunners on rescue helicopters flew into conditions that were sometimes even more dangerous than what had brought down the original aircraft, because the enemy knew that a downed American crew would attract rescue attempts and prepared accordingly. The drawdown of American forces after 1969 created specific challenges for the units that remained. As the size of the American presence in Vietnam shrank, individual units were consolidated, redesignated, or deactivated, and the crews that remained were doing more with less: fewer aircraft, fewer qualified crew members, stretched maintenance resources, and the awareness that the overall American commitment to the war was diminishing in ways that made it harder to motivate the same level of risk-taking that had characterized the war at its peak intensity. The short-timer's psychology, the specific anxiety of a soldier who could count the days remaining in his tour and was acutely aware of the statistical reality that the last few weeks were as dangerous as any other period, was particularly acute in the final years of American involvement, when the political signals from Washington made the war feel like it was winding toward an ending, regardless of what happened on the ground. The South Vietnamese Air Force, the VNAF, had been receiving UH-1 helicopters and training on them since the early 1960s, but the pace of Vietnamization after 1969 required a rapid expansion of VNAF capabilities that the training pipelines struggled to support. American door gunners and crew chiefs found themselves in a training role, as well as a combat role during the final years of American involvement, flying alongside VNAF crews, demonstrating techniques and trying to pass on in months the institutional knowledge that American crews had accumulated over a decade of combat experience. The limitations of this compressed knowledge transfer became apparent during the Easter Offensive of 1972, when VNAF helicopter units showed significant variation in capability and confidence, with some units performing creditably under pressure and others struggling with the intensity of combat against a conventional NVA force, equipped with anti-aircraft weapons that previous VNAF operations had rarely encountered at such scale and density. The Easter Offensive itself was a watershed in multiple senses. The NVA's use of T-54 and T-55 main battle tanks, modern Soviet-designed vehicles with 100mm main guns and frontal armor that no helicopter door gun could penetrate, demonstrated that the airmobile concept as practiced in Vietnam had significant limitations against an enemy equipped for conventional warfare rather than guerrilla operations. The anti-tank helicopter would become a major development priority after Vietnam, leading directly to the AH-64 Apache's TOW missile system. But during the Easter Offensive, American and VNAF crews had to improvise, using aerial rocket artillery and close air support coordination to engage the armor, rather than the direct fire that door guns could provide. The door gunner's role in an armor-heavy battle was reduced to what it had always been at its most basic: protecting the aircraft and crew, suppressing infantry that was trying to engage the helicopter, and providing close fire support to friendly ground forces against enemy infantry positions. The final American combat flights in Vietnam, the last evacuation operations, the final advisory missions, the last CSAR attempts for prisoners who were never recovered, carried a specific weight that the crews who flew them have described in ways that set those missions apart from the routine of combat operations. Flying over country that had been fought over for 10 years, that had absorbed hundreds of thousands of tons of ordnance and millions of hours of American aviation effort, knowing that this particular mission might be one of the last, created an awareness of finality and consequence that peacetime flying or even earlier phases of the war hadn't produced. The door gunners who flew those final missions were looking at a landscape that bore the marks of everything that had happened there, and they were doing so with the knowledge that they were part of the last chapter of an American story in Vietnam that had not ended the way anyone had hoped. The statistics of the entire campaign tell part of the story. American helicopter crews flew approximately 36 million sorties over the course of the war. They transported over 25 million passengers and 9 million tons of cargo. They conducted over 500,000 medical evacuation missions, saving the lives of an estimated 900,000 wounded personnel. They fired hundreds of millions of rounds of machine gun ammunition and tens of thousands of rockets. They operated in conditions ranging from Arctic cold at high altitude to tropical heat and humidity at sea level, in monsoon rains and blazing dry season heat, in day and night, in complex urban environments and featureless jungle, against an enemy that evolved continuously and adapted its tactics to counter every development in American airmobile capability. The door gunners were present at every aspect of this effort, and their contribution to the outcomes, operational, tactical, and strategic, cannot be separated from the larger story. The legacy of Vietnam helicopter operations on the subsequent development of American military aviation is direct and traceable. The Army's experience in Vietnam produced not just the AH-64 Apache and the improved UH-60 Black Hawk, but an entire doctrine of air assault operations that became the foundation of American ground force capability for the decades that followed. The 101st Airborne Division, the unit whose World War II lineage was in parachute operations, emerged from Vietnam as the 101st Airborne Division, Air Assault, a unit whose primary mode of combat power projection was helicopter-borne maneuver rather than fixed-wing parachute insertion. The air mobility concept that Hamilton Howze and his board had developed in the early 1960s, and that the 1st Cavalry Division and other units had paid for in blood at Ia Drang, and the A Shau Valley and 100 other engagements, had been absorbed into the permanent organizational DNA of the American Army in ways that no subsequent war could undo. The men who built that legacy, the pilots certainly, but equally the crew chiefs and the door gunners who made the helicopter a weapons system rather than merely a transport vehicle, deserve their specific place in that history. Their names are mostly not famous. The famous names from the Vietnam Helicopter War are mostly pilots: Hugh Mills, John Coltrane, Peter Dell'Aquila, the men whose aerial exploits generated the Medal of Honor citations and the magazine profiles and the histories of specific engagements. The door gunners were right there alongside them, doing work that was equally dangerous and sometimes more so, and their contributions are embedded in the same action reports, the same unit histories, the same casualty lists. They are there if you look for them. The Vietnam War ended formally for the United States in January 1973, but it did not end for the men who had fought it. The door gunners came home to a country that was deeply ambivalent about the war and, at its worst moments, directed that ambivalence at the men who had served in it. As if the question of whether the war should have been fought, which was a legitimate political question, was somehow answered by treating the men who had been sent to fight it as though they were responsible for the policy that deployed them. The injustice of this was felt acutely by Vietnam veterans of all branches and specialties, but perhaps especially by the men who had served in the most exposed and dangerous roles, the men who had paid the highest personal price for a policy they hadn't made and couldn't have changed. Coming home and being treated as either invisible or as objects of blame was a secondary wound added to everything else they had already carried out of the jungle. The decades since Vietnam have slowly produced something approaching justice for these veterans, though the process has been imperfect and incomplete. The formal recognition of PTSD as a medical condition, the expansion of VA services for combat trauma, the establishment of the Vietnam Veterans Memorial, these were steps toward acknowledgement that were meaningful to the men who had been waiting for them, sometimes for decades. Many door gunner veterans found that the community of their fellow veterans was the most reliable source of understanding and support, that the bond forged in those open doorways over the jungle was durable enough to sustain people through the long aftermath of the war. When you look at old footage of Vietnam, the kind that turns up in documentaries, in museum archives, in the personal collections that families are only now beginning to digitize and share, you'll see them. They look calm and collected in the footage because the camera catches them in the professional rhythm of their work, the movements practiced and automatic, the weapon handled with familiarity. But you can see it in their eyes. If the camera gets close enough, these were men who had been through something. Not heroes in the poster art sense, not figures from a recruiting advertisement, just young men who had been asked to do something extraordinarily hard in extraordinarily dangerous conditions, and who had done it and who were living with everything that entailed. The helicopter war asked more of them than anyone who stayed home could fully understand. What they gave in answer to that asking was everything they had. The concept of air mobility that Vietnam created and validated, the idea that ground forces could be made genuinely mobile through helicopters in ways that changed the fundamental geography of land warfare, continues to shape military thinking and military capability around the world today. Every army that fields attack and transport helicopters is working from the template that Vietnam wrote, paying the license fees in training budgets and equipment purchases and the ongoing cost of maintaining the human expertise that makes the system work. The door gunner, in whatever form the role takes in the modern force, aerial weapon systems operator, crew-served weapons specialist, is still there, still in the most exposed position on the aircraft, still doing the essential work of protecting the helicopter and its passengers during the moments when they are most vulnerable. The technology has changed enormously. The fundamental human reality of the role has changed less than the technology suggests. What Vietnam meant for the helicopter and what the helicopter meant for the door gunner was ultimately a transformation in the character of land warfare that nobody had fully anticipated when those first fragile R-4s lifted off in the jungles of Burma in 1944. The helicopter made the vertical dimension of the battlefield accessible to ground forces in ways that had previously been reserved for paratroopers and their expensive one-time insertions. It made the evacuation of wounded from previously inaccessible positions routine enough to save hundreds of thousands of lives. It created new tactical possibilities and new vulnerabilities simultaneously, as all transformative military technologies do, and it put a specific kind of young man in a specific kind of position. Open doorway, machine gun, the jungle 100 feet below, that tested everything the human being is capable of and asked him to keep doing it day after day until his tour ended. They were not flying over someone else's war from a comfortable remove. They were in it, exposed in every sense of the word, physically, psychologically, morally. hanging out of that doorway, strapped to the machine by a single nylon tether, with nothing between them and everything below except their training and their courage, and the 7.62mm rounds they were sending downrange. They were as close to the absolute reality of war as it is possible to be and still be in the air. The Vietnam War was many things and has been described in many ways and will continue to be analysed and debated for as long as people care about the history of the 20th century. But at its most immediate and most human level, it was a young man in an open doorway over the jungle doing his job, watching the tree line and waiting for whatever came next.